your people are going to be the most important thing when it comes to determining the success of anything that you decide to adopt, right? You can adopt literally world-class best practices like Uber, Netflix, these big tech companies, and not have the people to support it or understand it, and you will fail miserably. It's just the fact of the matter. The people are going to drive the culture, the tooling, and so on.
Hello, and welcome to a brand new episode of the Engati interview series. I'm your host, Kimberly, and we're really glad to have all of you join us today. The Engati interview series is a powerhouse of insights from industry experts and influencers from around the world. A platform that provides the latest news on AI, automation, and technologies that will help you grow your business. Come, be a part of our community. Learn, share, and grow with us. Today, we have with us a very special guest. We have the lead data scientist at Absa Group on the show. Welcome to the show, Daniel. We're so glad to have you join us today.
Awesome. Thank you.
Before we dive into our amazing interview with Daniel, don't forget to subscribe to Engati and tap the bell icon so that you get access to exclusive content coming from thought leaders from around the world. Well, Daniel, let's get started with the first question that we really have for you today. What is the pitfalls of best practices? And the first question would be, what really happens when we strive for best practice? Could you really explain to us that?
Sure. So I think it's first a good idea to, define what best practice is, right? In terms of, why was it created? And the definition, and I believe this is from like Wikipedia maybe, is that it's a method or technique that has been generally accepted as superior to any alternatives because it produces results that are superior to those achieved by other means, or because it has become a standard way of doing things. Now, if we go, and we consider industries that are well established, even, industries that are very well established within the specific countries that they operate in. So things like law, for example, where there is a standard way of doing things. They have their best practices.
Of course.
That's where it works really, really well. But in an industry that is evolving as fast as it is, as data science and data in general, AI, it's very difficult for us to determine what best practice is. And if you go and you look for, best practice, anything when it comes to AI, and you go and you look at what, the big companies are doing, what you're going to find is that they're all doing something different, and they've all got their own way of implementing their best practice. And what happens is, if you start looking and striving for these things and you start looking for best practice, you start, finding all these, like vendor solutions that are like, I think a good example is if you go and you look at the Gartner hype cycle, for example, is at the time where you're increasing, that innovation hype, all these new people coming into the game, are trying to jump on, what they think is going to be the next best thing. And they're always going to push that their stuff is, best practice. And if you can't, if you end up with, a million things on your plate and each one is, considered best practice, you're going to end up constantly never actually delivering value from your solutions. You're going to be constantly looking for the next best thing. And that's, I think, one of the big pitfalls of best practice in the data industry.
Yes, definitely. You really put it in the best way possible. What is the discerning hype from sustainable solutions? Can you really touch upon that?
Yeah, sure. So I think more and more as I mentioned, as these vendors enter the game, right? The ability to discern what is hype from what is, something that is going to be sustainable in the long term becomes more and more important. And one of the things to realize is that the only way that we're going to be able to create this discernment is by engaging with communities, watching these kind of talks, for example. I think something that's interesting is that notebooks, which happen to be, one of the most important tools for doing data science experimentation, only became adopted as best practice in 2020, right? They've been around for like 10 years minimum. And it's taken that long for people to say, okay, these are valuable and we know what to do with them.
Right.
So when you start hearing things like citizen data scientists, ML ops, explainable AI, transfer learning, all these like really like fancy terms that are, buzzwords to engage you, you need to be able to look at them and what, what specific problem they're trying to solve and whether that is an actual problem for you, right? So if, you operate in an industry where explainable AI is not so important, maybe that's manufacturing. I'm not sure. I'm from a bank. Everything is explainability is important. It's something that we care about. You shouldn't have to like jump on that hype cycle, right? You kind of say, okay, cool, it serves its purpose, but it's not for me, let's move on.
Yeah.
Whereas there's also going to be, so that's like hype, but on the sustainable side, you need to look at the things that everybody's talking about. What is everyone adopting? So the big one, and has been big for about 2 years now, is ML ops, right? So everybody is talking about ML ops. How do we put machine learning models into production? And personally, that is definitely at the top of the hype train right now. But the more we look at it, the more we realize that it's a sustainable long-term tool that we'll need to, or at least methodology that we'll need to adopt.
Correct. At the start of our conversation, you've mentioned that, organizations have been drastically changing in terms of the strategies that they use and stuff like that. How can businesses actually adapt global best practices for different industries, of course?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I think if we take it back and we consider a principle-based approach to what best practice might look like, we can look at certain key pillars that we can use to identify or discern what is valuable from what is not.
Mm-hmm.
And I think so. Here in South Africa, there's airports company South Africa. They run all the airports in the country, and their ex-COO, his name is Tebogo Mkho, I think is how you pronounce his name. He compares best practice to a raging river, right? And the way that he describes it is, you in your organization have your own raging river, right? And to stay afloat or to cross that river is going to be very different to another river, right? You might have very like not so turbulent flow, but your river is really deep. Whereas somebody else is going to have very turbulent flow with lots of rocks in it, for example, and there's some fish in there. And being able to adapt your, what you see to the context that you find yourself in is how you will determine what is best practice. So what I mean by that is, best practice is contextual. So that's why we need a principle-based approach, right? And I think when it comes to a lot of different, from an industry perspective,
Mm-hmm.
when we talk about data law, whatever that may be, those principles will differ. But in the data space, I think that there's 3 really important principles that we can consider for best practice. So one, and I think I'll talk about the most important one first, and that's people. So your people are going to be the most important thing when it comes to determining the success of anything that you decide to adopt, right? You can adopt literally world-class best practices like Uber, Netflix, these big tech companies, and not have the people to support it or understand it, and you will fail miserably. It's just the fact of the matter. The people are going to drive the culture, the tooling, and so on. And then what's also important about it is we as organizations tend to think that everything is urgent all of the time. So when we look into bringing people on, right, we bring people on for what we need now and lack the long-term, goals that we want to get from organization. And as a result, everything becomes urgent because as people evolve, these gaps happen, and then we enter the same kind of loop. So leveraging people is probably one of the most important things in terms of trying to discern what's good from what's not. The second thing is reusability, right? So when you adopt something or look at specific patterns, you need to make sure that they can be reused. But even more so, we are very, very lucky as a data community that a lot of people give back through open source tooling and so on. Even big companies that have paid services like H2O, for example, have open sourced a lot of their stuff, and you pay for the support, right? If you've got good people, right, you can leverage stuff that has been used, right? And that community is really, really helpful. And then lastly, it's autonomy, right? Any solution that or task that needs to be done or that is solved by a specific tool needs to be able to be completed and worked through in an autonomous fashion. You don't want to have to deal with like support or oversight or whatever that may be to kind of get things over the line. People need to be able to be empowered to do the work that makes them most productive. And what you'll find is that context, again, is very different. So I lead a team of people both in South Africa and in Europe. And contextually, the way that we like to work is very different. And the tools that we like to use are very different. And the solutions that we develop are very different. And if you don't give people the autonomy to choose the things that work for them, you're going to really struggle to adopt anything or get value from anything that you deliver.
Yes, definitely. You've definitely put in the more core basic concepts into a very explainable way. Thank you so much for that. Diving into a little deeper question is, what role do you think do data governance play while building, when companies build their AI strategies?
Also a very good question, and not something that can be answered in few words, right? So there's a lot of things that matter in terms of data governance when it comes to AI. And I think most prevalent for me as somebody that is a practitioner of AI and not necessarily data governance is data quality, right? So the famous saying, and it will be famous for years and years to come, is garbage in, garbage out, right? If you want to build good quality AI that can solve problems and add a lot of value, you need to make sure that the data that you have is clean, it is conformed, it does all the things that so that your data engineers and data scientists that are building these AI solutions are spending their time doing the things that they are best at, which is data science, AI, and so on. On top of just the data quality aspect, we also need to think about things like privacy, right? One thing that is quite concerning about AI is its ability to create really complex patterns. And if you don't have some kind of governance around security and privacy from that perspective, right, it's very possible that even if you do decide to make your data completely anonymous and so on, if Daniel is the only person that stays in South Africa that drives a white Opel, right, we don't need to know who Daniel is as a person. We can completely identify him just by South African white Opel. And these are the things that we need to be aware of and kind of critique our models for. I think GDPR, POPI, these things are things that will always be relevant as a result of AI, and especially our move to the cloud, right? So AI is no longer something that is deployed on premise anymore. It's now in the cloud and open to the public, and having a cloud security and privacy strategy in terms of the data that you're putting there and the workloads that you're running there are incredibly important. And then maybe a last comment that is maybe the most important, or at least the closest to me, is making sure that there is no harm done to people as a result of the data that you're using. And I don't know. So on our side, the impact or the bias that can be generated by AI solutions should fall under your governance structure for data in general, or at least your AI strategy. And having something in place to say, or to safeguard people from the results that your AI solutions might be generating is a good idea. Like a good example is, who should we give credit to, right? If our models are biased, we're going to be giving credit to people, like more credit to people that are not as deserving as others, purely because there is a bias within our data that we aren't aware of. And one of the things that I always like to say is that, and the reason why this is so important, is that from an AI perspective, our models have a lot more impact on people than people have on our models, right?
Right.
What I mean by that, 100%. Like what I mean by that is, our models are trained on millions and millions of people, right? So one person is just like a drop in this massive set, but the result of that is going to impact somebody's life quite heavily, especially, if like from a creative perspective, it's a no-brainer.
Those were some really amazing insights you threw in. Are there any other sound bites you'd like to leave our audience with?
No, I think that's I've said a lot, and I think just thank you for having me here.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Daniel. This was an amazing interview. Stay tuned for more such content coming from thought leaders from around the world. Thank you.